Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here with a man that needs really no introduction. He is a writer I have come to adore. I know many of y'all have read his work, and it's right after lunch. So we have the responsibility to keep you awake in this heat, and I hope that we can do it. I want to introduce Amor Towles. Amor is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, and his latest, The Lincoln Highway. They have sold 6 million, probably more now.
Yeah, something like that.
Is 6 million wrong?
No, it's right.
Around 6 million copies. I am so happy to be here with somebody that I adore, so thank y'all all for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so Amor, there's a part of your life story that is so wild, it reads like a bit of one of your novels. Take us back to when you were 10 years old and that message in a bottle.
Okay. First of all, thanks for coming, everybody. Jenna, thank you, as always, for sitting down with me. What Jenna's mentioning is when I was about 10 years old, my family would summer on off the coast of Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard Island, and I threw a note in a bottle into the ocean. And I think the first sentence says, to whoever finds this, I hope it made it to China. That was my vision. And so this is late in August. The summer ends. We go home to our house, and my mother's going through the mail, and there's this little letter like this big. And she says, Amor, there's a letter for Amor. And it's been typed out, Master Amor Towles, and in the upper left-hand corner it says New York Times. And it turns out that the person who ended up finding the bottle was a man named Harrison Salisbury. And Harrison Salisbury was really one of the great giants of journalism in the history of the New York Times, and had been the Hanoi correspondent for the New York Times during the Vietnam War, and was an international correspondent around the world. And eventually, he was the person who was charged with launching the op-ed page for the New York Times as a senior editor. And so he had found the bottle, and he says, dear Mr. Towles, I'm afraid that your bottle did not make it to China. But made me. But so we ended up in a correspondence that lasted from the time I was 10 until I was 18. And when I was 18, the first time I went to New York City, I met him. So I got to meet him in person after this extended correspondence. And so the odd part of the story here, or another odd element, is that my writing process is I don't tend to do research really until the end of the first draft of any work I'm doing. And so when I wrote A Gentleman in Moscow, I didn't do any research for the work. I wrote the first draft, and then I carried the first draft to Moscow to begin revising the book in Moscow, because I had never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel. And I figured that would make sense. Let's go live in the hotel and revise the work there. And so to get ready for that trip, I went and I started printing out first-hand accounts of life in the Metropole Hotel from the 1920s to the present. And there were many, because if you were famous and you went to Russia in the 1920s or 30s or 40s or 50s, you either ate at, danced at, slept at the Metropole Hotel. So I had first-hand accounts by John Steinbeck and E. Cummings and the playwright Lillian Hellman. And then I realized that all the journalists from the 20s through the Cold War all wrote about the Metropole Hotel because that's where they drank. And so all the bureau chiefs did this. And so as I was getting ready to go, all of a sudden I'm checking one of these memoirs, and one of the things it says is, that was the night when Harrison arrived, and da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, oh my God, I completely forgotten that Harrison Salisbury was also the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. And so I thought, he must have written about it. And sure enough, he wrote a memoir about his life in Moscow. So I got a hold of the copy. I took it to Russia. And in the hotel, I read through his memoir. And in the course of rewriting the book, I ended up weaving a number of things that he had seen firsthand into the narrative, such as the day that Stalin died. The day that Stalin died, nobody would release the news. They were worried there was going to be a coup. And suddenly tanks surrounded the city of Moscow, and all foreigners were told they couldn't leave their buildings. Everybody was under sort of temporary house arrest. And Salisbury gets sort of a signal that there's something can be seen from the Mexico attache's apartment in the corner of the hotel. And all the journalists flood in, and a huge, all these limos start pulling up to the building across the street. And among them is, in essence, a hearse. And they take out the coffin of Stalin. And what the senior people who were worried about the coup had decided is, we're going to announce his death, like, as we unload the body with the entire Politburo there. Because we don't want any backroom actions of somebody getting the secret police to take over the city, et cetera. And so he witnessed this. So I incorporated that into the novel. And then I was sort of letting the revision rest, and all of a sudden I thought to myself, if I'm going to incorporate Salisbury's memories into the story, I should incorporate Salisbury. So that's in the book. It says the American journalist Harrison Salisbury goes into the room and witnesses this. And late in the novel, for those of you who read it, the main character, needs a disguise. And so from the coat room in the hotel, he steals the trench coat and fedora of the American journalist Salisbury when he needs the disguise. And Mr. Salisbury had passed away by that time, but that was my way as sort of a young, someone who had been shown sort of respect by this older man and who had had this long-standing conversation with me. It was my way of trying to pay him back a little bit.
All from a message in a bottle.
All from a message in a bottle. It's true. Oh, thank you.
So first Salisbury and then Peter Matheson.
Yes.
Who became a mentor to you in many ways. Talk about how he influenced you.
I began writing fiction as a kid, and I wrote it in high school. I wrote it in college. And when, but the funny thing about, I began writing fiction in first grade. It's when I realized this is really what I want to do. And for other people who have fallen in love with an art when you're young, you have this sort of dual life between 10 and 20 or whatever, which is that half of you, through your adolescence, is thinking, I can do this. I think I could really be a writer. I think I have this talent, and you kind of compare yourself to your peers and then to actually other people you're reading and to your heroes, and you sort of keep measuring yourself and saying, yeah, I think I can do this. That's half. The other half is, I am out of my mind. There's how would I may be a total joke. There's no way I would know. And so you kind of live in this uncertainty as you continue to write and read. And as I say, this would be true of any young artist. And during that time, like the compliments that you get from your mother don't matter. Your mother matters a lot, but like that isn't what makes a difference. And so then I got to Yale, and Peter Matheson, who I admired as a writer, came to visit for a semester. You had to apply to get in. I got into his seminar, and after a couple of weeks, at the end of the seminar, he said, "Hey, do you mind? Could you stay after class for a minute?" And so everybody left, and he said, "Listen, Amor, I don't know anything about you, and I don't know why you're here. I don't know what you want, but based on the 3 stories that you've submitted, I think there's a possibility that you may be gifted at this. And so I'm going to take your time here very seriously, and I hope that you are going to take your time with me just as seriously." And that was a major turning point in my life, because that was the first time that sort of an outsider, someone who I admired and who respected, sort of acknowledged the work that I was doing. And I tell other young artists, this is a very important moment in your life as a young artist, but you don't need it to happen every year. You need it to happen like once a decade, because you can ride on that. 5 years later, you're still like, Peter Matheson told me. To yourself, not to the public. But anyway, so Peter ended up being my mentor, both in my craft, but also this major figure in terms of giving me the additional confidence to think that I was not delusional.
So, but the one half of you that said, I don't know if I can do it, might have won out a little, right? For a little bit, you went to Wall Street.
Well, yeah.
A little bit, right?
I did go work. I worked in the investment business for 20 years, and I was.
And what did Peter say when you told him that's what you were going to do?
Yeah, what he said was, I was working on Wall Street. I was 25, living in New York, and I was broke, and I was a little claustrophobic. I was feeling lonely and claustrophobic, so I did go into the investment business, and I stayed. A friend of mine, I helped a friend of mine build a firm, and it was an enormously satisfying career. But along the way, I got to writing fiction again on the weekends. But before I got back to writing fiction, Peter did take me aside and said that his experience was that everybody he'd ever known who had gone to Wall Street had never come back to the arts, and that I should assume that my life as an artist was over, and that was kind of the dread that would be true is kind of what ended up getting me to go back and start working on weekends and at night, and eventually I wrote a novel over 7 years I didn't like, and then I wrote Rules of Civility, and then when that became a bestseller, I resigned. Thank you.
And you got to speak with him after Rules of Civility was published, right?
He did. He was alive at the time that book came out, and so we had lunch, and that was a great relief, yeah.
Can you share any of that conversation, or you like to keep that close?
He was very, well, this is the only thing I'll tell you about it, because it's kind of funny, is when I finished the Rules of Civility, the first draft, I sent it to him, and I said, Peter, I just want you to know that I've been working on it, and this is the first draft, and I feel really good about it. I think it's probably the first book that I've written that is really worthy of submission, and I'm interested in your feedback. And there's a 25-year-old woman who's the center of that book. She's the narrator, and it's set in the 1930s. And his letter comes back, and he says, listen, first of all, Amor, I can't understand why you're continuing to write about the 1930s. You're always writing these stories about older America, and, and for some reason you won't write about your own times. And he says, but to tell you the truth, I find that this is a terrible thing. I find that spunky, opinionated, witty women are as boring in fiction as they are in film, as they are in life.
Wow, he probably wouldn't have liked me very much.
So I was like, oh man. So it's like, damn. So you kind of you put the letter in the away, and you're like, oh damn it. So then the book ends up getting sold at auction. I revised it, but it gets sold at auction, and then it comes out and it becomes a bestseller. And we go to have, and he sends me a note. The week it hits the bestseller list, he sends me a note, and he says, Amor, this is what we call eating crow. And he said, my sister, who's one of the greatest readers I've ever known, says that the minute that your book ended, she was sad it was over and wanted to start again. And he's like, and that's as much as you could ask, And so he was very sweet about sort of recognizing. But I got to say, the serious thing, again, for young artists, middle-aged artists, old artists, whatever age you are, is in a way, in retrospect, Peter not liking that manuscript was almost as valuable as the confidence he showed in me at the age of 19, because it sort of meant that, this book ended up working despite the fact that my hero, my mentor, my first real supporter, it wasn't for him. He didn't like it, And that was it's a lesson that at a certain point as a young artist, you have to sort of say, you know what, I have to have the confidence in the work myself, even if my mentors or my heroes or my friends don't like the manuscript, you have to have the confidence in your own work. And so that was sort of a weird gift in its way.
Sounds like he didn't like women that much, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
You like women, you just,
well, you don't have to go there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Lincoln Highway. I found it to be, and I hope many of you have read it, but I found it to be a little humorous that after reading Gentlemen in Moscow, which takes place over 3 decades in one spot, you took to the open roads in a 10-day period.
Yeah.
Did that feel like a relief?
Yeah. What I'll tend to do is I'll develop multiple ideas at all times. And so in my office, I have ideas for books which are written out on a 3x5 card. I have ideas for books which are written out over, 4 pages in a notebook by hand. But in some cases, I have multiple notebooks where I've been thinking about a story for a long period of time and slowly building it out in greater and greater detail. And I have multiple stories that are kind of fit that profile. So when I finish a book, I kind of look to those stacks to say, what am I going to do next? And so it is not a coincidence that having written this book that spanned 30 years with an aristocrat, a sophisticated sensibility at its center, that largely takes place in space, I'm immediately like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that story about the 10 18-year-olds, the 3 18-year-olds on a road trip for 10 days, because because I get to shift gears. Now, to some degree, it's sort of a liberation to kind of be able to, I get to go talk about movement. I get to do it in a fast-paced fashion. But part of it is my real desire to shift like that is that when you go from a 30-year story with a sophisticated sensibility in a single location to this sort of 10-day road trip with 3 18-year-old young men, what it requires you to do is retool all the elements of your craft, because all the various elements of craft that you could think of, setting, plot, metaphors, similes, allusions, the tone, the point of view, all the very vocabulary, all would be very different in order to serve this other story. So when I make a shift like that, what's really exciting for me is that I have to sort of set aside everything I've just learned through writing A Gentleman in Moscow and kind of start from scratch and start to ask myself, what is this going to sound like? What is the vocabulary now? What is the poetics now? What's the pacing? How are the settings described? What are the tone, the voice of the people? And all that's going to be different, so it's a whole new effort of invention, and that's what's fun for me. And then I hope that's fun for the reader, too.
It was so fun. If you haven't read it, his books are for sale at the front. I feel like I'm selling merch. But one of the things that I loved is it's set in the 1950s. I read, or maybe we discussed, that it was partly inspired by your own father. Because he lived during that period.
Yeah.
And the Lincoln Highway itself is, such an important part of it. So kind of go into all of that, please.
Both?
Setting, all three, your father, the highway, and the time period.
So,
you don't have to do it in that order.
Yeah, so when I have an idea for a story, I'll like in the case of the Lincoln Highway, usually it's a sentence that captures my imagination. And in the case of the Lincoln Highway, for those of you who read it, you could probably guess this. I thought one day, what if a kid on the way home from a juvenile prison, being driven by the warden, ready to start his life anew, discovered as the warden drove away that 2 kids from the prison had hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. That's kind of what I started with. And when I have an idea like that, if it's interesting to me, usually it comes very quickly with some attachments. So within a matter of minutes, I thought, this is good. This is going to be set in the 50s. It'll start in the Midwest. The farm will be going into bankruptcy. The kids in the trunk will be from New York. The hero will want to go to West. They'll want to go to New York City, so they'll go to New York City. And it'll be 10 days. All that I know within a matter of minutes. And then you go through this multi-year process of trying to imagine the whole thing in detail. Now, what Jenna was referencing earlier is that I did not ask myself why 1954. It felt like the right time to tell the story for a variety of reasons. Let's go with it. And you start to imagine it from there, and the more you imagine, the more sure you are that it's where the story belongs. And once again, I didn't do any research for it, but I felt very comfortable telling the story for whatever reason. And only really, when I got to the very end, I was finishing the first draft, did it occur to me, this is kind of embarrassing in a way, is that this takes place in June of 1954, the 10 days, and the 3 main characters are all about 18 years old. And all of a sudden, as I was kind of wrapping up, I thought, I bet, my dad, who had died just a few years before, I thought, he must have been about 18 in 1954. And I went back and kind of did the math, and sure enough, he was exactly 18 in 1954. And I was like, as soon as I thought, I was like, of course. Because what it occurred to me was that we are, all of us, forever, are all enormously influenced by, let's call it, the decade between when we're 6 and 16, let's say. Because whatever is happening in the world between 6 and 16, culturally, politically, whether there's wars or depression, what's happening in the musical scene, that will forever influence kind of the way we see the world and how we think of ourselves and what we tell our children, et cetera. That's a big influence on us, whether we're kids of the 60s or of the depression or of the war years. And what had occurred to me as I was sort of thinking of this is that the second decade that has almost as much influence on that decade for us is the one where our parents were that age. Because when our parents were that age, being influenced by the world, that's what they bring to us. and to how they parent us and how they describe the world and how they, what they expect of us and the rules they give us and the morals they give us, et cetera. And so, as I said, as soon as I recognized, I thought, oh, right, this world I've just designed in 1954, all the various ethics of the characters and the battles they're having, and it's really an expression of the world that my father and mother had sort of raised me under the shadow of, if you will. You know what I mean? So I knew much more about it than I would have thought even myself, in the same way that any of you would know a lot about the world as it was when your parents were teenagers. You know?
It's so interesting. And the Lincoln Highway, it connects, I know that was too many questions in one, that's my problem. It connects our country, but it isn't really a highway anymore.
Well, yeah. It's really,
Talk about
it's a
this,
lowercase h.
Tell in the symbolism really throughout the book of how important that highway is.
Yeah, and part of the story too is that I did design the Lincoln Highway over a period of years, and then there were multiple notebooks in which I planned the whole story, and there was a very detailed outline that I created before writing the book, because that's kind of my process. At no point in all of the books in which I've been outlining and designing the story is the word the Lincoln Highway in those, let's say the first 3 notebooks. The book was called Unfinished Business. And in the story where it said that the characters were going to leave the farm, and instead of taking a left to go to California, they would take a right to go to New York City, it said they took Route X. You know, because I was like, fine. As I'm making the notes and imagining the story, that suited me fine. And I got to the point where I had now begun the first chapter, and the outline was in much more concrete form, and I thought, I now need to know what that road is. Because by the time I get to the end of the second chapter, they're going to get on that road, and that's going to have implications for what they see, where they might stop, what might occur that I haven't thought of yet in the narrative, even though I know what's going to happen in all 10 days. So I broke out a map of America, and I'm looking at the roads that go through Nebraska. And I see, oh yeah, that's perfect. From the center of Nebraska, this road heading due east, hooking up and going all the way to New York through Pennsylvania. And the map says, Route 30 in Nebraska. And then in parentheses it says, formerly known as the Lincoln Highway. And I was like, what is the Lincoln Highway? And some of you may know, most of you probably would not if you hadn't read my book. But the Lincoln Highway was the first highway that went all the way across the United States. It begins in Times Square and it ends in the Pacific Ocean in Lincoln Park in San Francisco. And it was built in the 19-teens by an American entrepreneur. At the time, the federal government had no interest in road systems. They did not spend any money on it. They didn't influence it. And so all road systems were basically state run, and they all kind of grew out of the local cities, into the countrysides, into the suburbs. But there were no roads that were designed to, say, go from Boston to Denver. That didn't really exist. And in 1915 also, because still pretty early in the car, you have to picture that between, let's say, Pittsburgh and Denver, there were no hotels, there were no gas stations, there were no restaurants. So if you wanted to drive across the country that time, it could take you a month. You had to carry gas, water, medical equipment, repair extra parts for the car. So if you look at the pictures of people who crossed the United States in 1915, it looked like a polar expedition, and with the goggles, the whole thing. And so I think that it was something like in 1915, 100 people drove across the United States, and that was it. So this guy, Carl Fisher, who had invented the first headlight that was used in all the cars in the United States. He became a very rich man. He retired in his 30s, worth about $100 million in our terms. And he became obsessed. He then went on to invent the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He launched the Indy 500 as a spare time. He created Miami Beach, which was a barrier island off the coast of Miami, and he was the first person to build a building there, a hotel. So all of Miami Beach was sort of founded by him. He's a very interesting, unusual guy. But at a certain point in the 19-teens, he decides Americans need a way to drive all the way across the country. He saw it really as a patriotic venture so that people could, see this beautiful country of ours from sea to shining sea. And so he went and raised money from the public. And it took him a couple of years, but he raised millions of dollars, and then he built the first highway to cross the country. and it was called the Lincoln Highway. And so that was the most famous road in America by far in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And within 5 years of him building the road, where I said that it was like about 150 people drove across the United States per year before it, 20,000 Americans a year would drive across the country once it existed. And so it really had this dramatic change in the way people both saw the country but also felt free to move, to take a job in another state, and was all doing all these crazy things. And the main reason that most people don't know what it is because of the highway system that was built in the 1950s by Eisenhower. And once those were built, those are the roads that everybody drove on. So the Lincoln Highway still exists, but to our modern eyes, it looks like a rural road, just cutting across the Midwest.
Did you drive it?
I have driven, because again, I drove it after I wrote the first draft. I'd never been to Nebraska, and I'd never been on the Lincoln Highway. But so I finished the first draft, and I flew to Nebraska, and then I rented a car, and I got to the town that I kind of imagined the story beginning, and then I drove east on the Lincoln Highway. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so I got to go to Amor's office, which I'm sure by listening to him speak, you can tell he's a genius, you are. And to be in his office and see the notebooks filled with stories and his process was so fascinating. Will you talk a little bit about the postcards? I know you use real items.
Yes. So for those of you who have not read the Lincoln Highway.
Who hasn't read the Lincoln Highway? And it's okay.
No, it's okay.
That's
a lot of people.
Rainn Wilson, you haven't read it? Sorry, Amor. I can't help it. I'm doing a panel with you. You're a writer. Anyway, sorry.
A very legitimate position.
Okay, go back to it. Go ahead.
All right, so for your benefit. In the very beginning of the story, the hero comes home, his father's died, his mother is long gone. She abandoned the family and went west when they were kids. And they've not heard from her since. And so the young hero says, I think we're going to go to Texas, to his 8-year-old brother. The farm's in bankruptcy. We're going to get in my car. Dad left us a little bit of money that he hid away, and we're going to take the money and we're going to head to Texas and start life anew. And the brother says, no, we have to go to California. And the hero, Emmett, says, why do we have to go to California? And so the young Billy, the 8-year-old, says, because when Dad died and you were in prison, we went through his things, as a part of the process. And there was a box with, the birth certificates and the deed and all that kind of stuff. And in it was this. And he puts out, and what it is a little envelope, and inside are 8 postcards that were written by their mother to them when she left the family, when Emmett was 10 and Billy was 1. And the 8 postcards are from 8 cities along the Lincoln Highway, ending in San Francisco. And Billy what he says is, Emmett says, how would we know that she was even in San Francisco? And Billy says, because that's the last postcard. She obviously sent us these to let us know where she would be so we could come and find her later, and so that's why we have to go. Mm-hmm. And so again, you kind of, I know this is going to happen, and I'm writing the whole story, and then it kind of gets to the point where after years of design, I'm writing the actual scene where Billy spreads the postcards out on the table. And so I thought to myself, actually, I would like to see what that would look like. So I tracked down one of these, there's multiple of them, companies that sell antique postcards across the United States. And I began search for postcards from the various cities along the Lincoln Highway from 1954. And I ended up buying, the 8 postcards that she sent. And so I could kind of lay them out on my table, these 8 postcards from the 50s, to sort of see what they would see in that moment, or what Emmett would see as his brother sort of made this outrageous proposal. So I do like to kind of weave in things like that. Yeah.
And that was such a pivotal moment in the book too, because it inspired them.
Yeah, well, it has a big impact. Another version for those of you who know the story, but again, this comes from very early Billy is a very particular kid, the 8-year-old. He's got collections. He keeps everything in order. He's kind of repeats himself occasionally. He takes things very literally. He's sort of that kind of a little kid, but he's very smart. He remembers what he's read, because whatever he reads 20 times. And what he doesn't read, he's not interested in. You know? So he's that kind of a kid. And I knew he's got collections. And I had designed the book, most of it, the events. And I got to the point of sort of trying to figure out, well, as they go out on the road, he's got a backpack he carries with him everywhere. And I thought, yeah, this would be great. When he goes off with his brother to New York, he'll take one of the collections with him. And I'm like, what? And he's going to get on there. They're going to get on a freight train because they don't have any money, and they're going to get on a freight train and go across the country. The brother and the son, the two brothers, jump on the train. And I was like, yeah, maybe they're going to separate when they're on the train briefly, and a dangerous person is going to find Billy in a freight car. I kind of know all this. And I'm at this moment started deciding, while Billy's in his room, and his brother's looking in, he's like playing with his collections, and it's like, what is the collection that he's going to bring on the road? And I'm like, I don't know. And you start to go through different ideas, maybe this, maybe that. And now, so quick backup here. My great-grandmother lived until she was 100. And when I was 18, we celebrated her 100th birthday. And at her 100th birthday, we did not bring her presents, as you can imagine. 100-year-old does not want presents. But so she brought something for each of the great-grandchildren, only the great-grandchildren. And what we all got was a U.S. silver dollar minted in 1882, the year that she was born, just for the great-grandkids. So I have carried this with me throughout my life, and it sits on my desk. And so as I'm sitting there thinking, what is the collection that Billy is going to carry? And I'm doing these different things in my head, toy soldiers, baseball cards, comic books, whatever. And suddenly I'm like, no, that's it. It's going to be the silver dollars. He's going to try to collect one silver dollar from every year, kind of, between whatever, the Civil War and the 1950s, and that'll be his collection. And then you have this, and I'm like, what is he going to keep it in? And my mother had given me, as a kid, I loved old things. She'd given me an old tobacco box, a George Washington plug tobacco box, and that's in my office. And I thought, that's great. He'll do it in the tobacco box, and I'm kind of thinking of the silver dollar being dropped in this tin box, and then I'm like, oh, of course, what's going to happen is when they're on the freight train, and Billy's left alone, and the dangerous person arrives in the freight train, he's going to think maybe the kid has some food, and Billy's going to move his backpack, and you're going to hear the silver dollars shake in the tin box. And that's what the guy is going to try to get, is going to try to steal the silver dollars from Billy. And that's what's going to really amp things up. And so, but this is kind of the way, again, you take sort of this idea, a broader idea of what's going to happen, and then something very specific that's sitting on your desk ends up weaving its way into the narrative.
I'm going to mail you something.
Yes,
and
for the
just
next
see
book.
if it happens to get into his next book.
That would be great. That would be great.
The other thing I learned when I was visiting you is how all of your books, and I tell everybody this, how all of your books intersect.
That's true.
Please explain it, because it's wildly fascinating.
I do kind of like to have my books sort of have little links. So, many Rules of Civility and The Lincoln Highway has a lot of overlap in that Billy and Emmett, they become friends with this character, Wooly, who's a upper-class New Yorker. And he is the nephew of a main character in Rules of Civility named Wallace Wolcott. And in Rules of Civility, Wallace Wolcott loans his family's large summer house in the Adirondacks to Katie and to Tinker, his friends, and they go there and they fall in love there, in essence. And that building is very central, and it's the concluding moments really of the Lincoln Highway occur in that same house. And so there's all these sort of connections and threads that operate between the two books. But my favorite, which is sort of a little odd, is that, and this is really odd, is Gentleman in Moscow spans 30 years, takes place in Russia, obviously. And it ends on the 21st of June, 1954. And and it kind of goes from June 1922 to June 21st, 1954. I wrote when I was writing The Lincoln Highway, I was like, okay, 10 days. It's going to be a 10-day story. 54 feels good. The middle of the 50s, a perfect quiet time in the United States. The civil rights movement's about to begin. Vietnam War is coming. The equal rights movement's about to begin. All these things are about to happen, but if they haven't happened yet, that's great. So that works. And then I'm like, what month? I'm like, should be just before summer, because they're going to go to the summer house to try to get the money, this house in the Adirondacks, and they're going to want to get there before the July 4th weekend. And so maybe they'll go in like mid to late June. That's perfect. So we'll start like around June 10th or 11th or 12th, and then we'll end. So I'm writing the whole thing, and I get to be like, and I'm not kidding, like 3/4 of the way into writing The Lincoln Highway. And all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, this book is going to end on the 21st of June, 1954, which is the same day that A Gentleman in Moscow ends, June 21st, 1954. So then, for those of you who read A Gentleman in Moscow, what you may know or may recall is that that book culminates at midnight on the 21st of June, 1954, when all the telephones in the Metropole Hotel ring simultaneously. That's the culminating moment, midnight, the 21st of June, 1954. So in The Lincoln Highway, the culminating moment when Billy and Emmett drive away from the Adirondacks occurs at 5 p.m. on the 21st of June, 1954. But because of the time change, that's right, these two moments, the two culminating moments in the two books in the final pages occur at the exact same moment in historical time.
It's amazing.
And I don't know what that means, but I love it. I think it's just crazy.
I
think
mean,
it's crazy. I don't know.
Again, you're either a genius or...
No, yeah, or crazy. But yeah,
No, it's... so now, tell us what you're working on next.
Yep.
Will it start in 1954?
Well, so I'm...
Or end?
The next thing for me is that in April, a collection of my short stories will come out, and so in whatever that is now, 8 or 9 months, and 6 of those stories are set in New York, and most of them are kind of in around the year 2000. So that'll be the closest to contemporary times that I've written about in terms of your ability to read it. And then half of that book is actually something called Eve in Hollywood. And Eve in Hollywood, in Rules of Civility, those who remember that story, Eve, Katie's best friend, who's a very independent-minded, sort of hilarious kind of character, she, late in that book, is going home to Indiana to see her family, and then she never arrives. And the parents call Katie and said, Eve never... came to Indiana when she said she was coming, and then they investigate, and it turns out that at the last minute she extended her ticket to Hollywood, and she's gone. They can't find her. And so at the very end, in the epilogue of Rules of Civility, Katie talks about seeing a picture of Eve in Hollywood leaving a nightclub with Olivia de Havilland in the spring of 1939. And so when I finished Rules of Civility, I was really intrigued by what is Eve doing in Hollywood in 1938. So years ago, I wrote 6 short stories that sort of that start with her on the train, and you sort of learn what happens to her in the first few months of being in Los Angeles in 1938. And that existed for 15 years. And then about a year ago, I was like, you know what? I kept thinking about more. And I knew other things that would happen to her and other things that would happen. And so I went back and I turned that into, that's like a 120-page story now. It's really a novella. And with murder and blackmail, it's great, So the short story collection is the 6 New York stories and this very long group of stories that follow Eve in Hollywood. And that'll come out in April. And then a year later, if all goes well, another novel will show up.
Awesome. We can't wait.
Thank you.
I know I speak for all of you all that I'm glad you left Wall Street.
Me too.
I wish you had left a little earlier.
Yeah, me too.
But I want to open it up to questions. I hope you all have some questions to ask Amor. If you do, raise your hand. And don't be shy. This is sort of looking like my 3rd grade class. Thank you for taking one for the team. We will bring a microphone around to all of you.
Yeah, no, I got it. Well, you took my question as it relates to the correlation of all the stories, which I find fascinating. And I also echo you and thank you for leaving Wall Street. So this is kind of my second backup question, which I just came up with. But in Sally's voice, Page 104, you said, "For what is kindness but the performance of an act that is both beneficial to another and unrequired?" She goes on to say there's no kindness in making a bed and making a pie, etc., right? And she said, "Nope. I said to myself while climbing into bed and switching off the light, there is no kindness in any of that, for kindness begins where necessity ends." Do you just come up with that?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, is that a belief that you have that you build into a character? I mean, that's pretty prolific.
Yeah, thank you.
Good, really good question.
So, the honest truth about that, well, thank you very much. The honest truth about that is in any of my work, when a reader reaches out, like if you go to amortowles.com, you can send an email right to me, or if someone approaches me at an event like this, and they say, this passage meant a lot to me, or this phrase or this paragraph, or I sent it to my daughter, or I read it out loud to my wife, or whatever, because I thought it struck me as very meaningful. 99% of the time, when someone says that, including this example of yours, it is something that I would never have said in the course of my daily life. It would not have occurred to me. I wouldn't say it to my kids. I wouldn't say it to a friend. I wouldn't meditate it in my own free time. What's happened is that I have created a person who I am not, with a different personality and a different background. Sally. Who's sort of willful, and she's, a woman whose mother has died, and her father has basically made her become the woman who takes care of the house. And she's sort of forced into this 1950s vision of being a housekeeper before she's even 18, and being angry about it, but, being kind of a Christian and, at the same time, but also like a troublesome Christian. But anyway, so you create that personality with that background, that I am not that person. I haven't had that background. I don't have that personality. And then I put that person in a situation that I have never been. And as I'm writing about that person in that situation, occasionally something just comes out. Suddenly the person will say, that whatever, kindness. See, I don't even know. Kindness begins where necessity ends.
Yeah.
And usually when that happens, it goes, the paragraph is really fast, and then you get the culminating sentence. And usually I'm like, bam, period. And then I'm like, well done, Sally. Wow. Sally, you nailed that. It's hilarious, And so,
You don't say well done, Amor?
No, because it's really them. And there's a great thing. As long as I'm talking about Sally, I love it because I remember this feeling, the same feeling what happened there. She gets called into school because Billy's in trouble. And she's kind of keeping an eye on Billy while his father's died and his brother's in prison. And the headmaster's called in and said, we're doing it's the Cold War, and we've been doing this drill where you get under your desk, if there's an alarm, and Billy won't get under the desk, and Billy explains that he has read that heroes confront what they're afraid of. You have to face what you're afraid of. And that it seemed like being under a desk, you would not be able to confront the challenge that faced you, and so he didn't think it was a good thing to do, and so he's gotten in trouble. And so the headmaster explains this to Sally, and Sally, who's defends Billy, from the first, she describes the headmaster who is balding, and and has been there since she was in school, and he's sort of an annoying guy, and she's not impressed with him. And what she says to him is, listen, that you should know. I'm not a scientist. I did very badly in science, but it strikes me that being under a desk is going to be as protective during a nuclear attack as the hair that you come over your bald spot protects you from the sun. And again, I was like, that just came, because Sally would say that. I would never say that.
Yes.
Hearing about your process was really interesting, and I could be totally off base here because it's been a good year or so since I've read Lincoln Highway, but I seem to remember that there was a lot of clock and watch imagery in it.
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
That is
okay. Something tells me that you might have a process of coming up with thematic imagery and symbols in your work, and if so, could you talk about that, please?
You know what? That you have intended motifs, and there's unintended motifs. And my preference is actually the unintended ones. Occasionally you'll say like, okay, this this is going to sync up with that, and like in the case of Lincoln Highway, there's a character named Ulysses, and Billy explains to Ulysses, who rightfully assumes that he's been named after Ulysses S. Grant, as a Black American, and showing celebrating the fact that Ulysses S. Grant led the fight against the South, and so he imagines it, but Billy corrects him by saying, no, I think based on your personal experience, because you went to the Second World War and your family left you and you can't find your family and you're actually based on the great Ulysses from the Greek, epic. And so as soon as that's in there, then there's all kinds of imagery around the Odyssey and around, those kinds of things, which I'm very conscious of as motif. The clocks thing, I did not notice. So when the book was over, I think it was one of my first readers was like, man, a lot of watches and clocks. And I'm like, what? What? And then you kind of go back and you're like, oh yeah, that's true. There's like, there's Woolley gives a watch to Billy that had been given to him in Rules of Civility by his uncle, and there's a grandfather clock that Woolley winds and that is usually left unwound, and there's sort of all these different things, and those. Sometimes when I'm revising, I see that, because you're reading the whole thing through as in a period of, say, 72 hours. You read the book from beginning to end when you're revising. You'll do that a number of times, 10 times. And so then you'll often see things that you hadn't noticed before, that this keeps coming up. And then usually, those are the ones they say I like, because you have to trust that your subconscious has done that wisely, and that some poor graduate student is going to be mulling over that later, But in serious, it's like I am an outliner. I'm a very detailed outliner, and it's worth talking about why I'm an outliner, because it's a little counterintuitive. I outline every chapter, what happens in it, who's in it, their backgrounds, the settings, the events. I do it all. It's all laid out before I begin with the first page. And then, of course, it evolves over time, but it's very carefully defined in advance. And the reason I do that is because when I'm actually writing a chapter, what I want to be driving the process as I string sentences together is my subconscious. I want the poetic, dreamlike, imagery-filled, inexplicable quality of the subconscious to be influencing the words I choose, the images I choose, the connections I make, where that's the artistic imagination really comes alive. And as I say, my instinct or my experience is that if I don't know what's going to happen in the chapter, then the other part of the brain takes over, because it has to say, okay, what's going to happen? What does the room look like? Who's coming through the door? What is their personality like? What are they going to say? And all that stuff, that takes over. And then you sort of write very punchy prose that just says the thing, And so then I'm interested in, I say, infusing the language with poetry at that point. So I do this odd thing, which is I outline it to maximize the poetry. And that's where I think that all those motif type things can come from, that as you're writing along, you're like, oh, and there's going to be a watch here, and you don't really ask yourself why, but you just go with it. And you dig deeper and deeper into the image, and then later on, you're like, oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's sort of that rhymes with this thing earlier in the book. There's a harmony there.
It's really fascinating. Okay, we probably have time for just 2 more questions if we keep them pretty tight.
Sure.
Okay.
So I just actually read Rules of Civility after Lincoln Highway. And at the end of the book, I just felt like this kind of sadness, because somehow Tinker just leaves. He's gone. He's into the mist. And I've never been able to let go of that. And I wonder if he's still somewhere in your consciousness. And also, does that have anything to do with your time at Wall Street?
Well, I answer the first question first, because I don't know the answer to the second. But that book is really kind of designed as a year in the life. Now, she's telling it from decades later, so we have a glimpse of what her life is like later, and that infuses her observations about what happened in this year when she's 25. And there is something very obviously bittersweet about that ending, and I apologize if you haven't read the end of the book, you don't know that, but it's fine. The book is still great, even if you know that. but it is a bittersweet ending. But I used to have some people, when that book came out, would come up and say, how could you? And by the way, it says that they're not together on the first page, and that's one of the funny things about the book.
Yeah.
Because she's looking back and she said, "Well, of course we weren't. I hadn't seen him in whatever since that day, 20 years ago, whatever it is." And then people would get to the end and go, "What? They're not together?" It's like that's on the first page, But that's great because it means they've gotten so wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
They've forgotten it, or they still, even though that's happened, they want it to somehow turn out differently. But and people would come up to me and say, "How could you do that?" And I think what's interesting about it is the way I think about it is that you can all do your own little thought experiment on this. The question I kind of ask is, how many of the ushers and bridesmaids in your wedding are you like actively connected to? Like see them on an annual basis. Now some, I'm sure you are. They're your best friends. And some are family. But I guarantee you there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 in there that were like friends in high school or college at that moment, and you had to be an usher or bridesmaid, but then your lives went in different directions, and you may not even know where they are. Or you don't, maybe the email's older, but you're not in touch with them. And that's totally life. That's the way it goes. And so if I asked you all the people you kissed in the decade between you were 18 and 26, and I hope it was 100, whatever, where are they? You don't know, you kidding? So.
Well, now we have Instagrams.
Well, I know, yeah, now you know more than you should know. That's true. That's true. That's been the downfall of Facebook. Right, you get my point. That's part of what that book is about. It's about the intensity of that moment and the reality that some things that come out of that moment become your life, but other things feather away, and even if they're wonderful, like they're no longer a part of your life in the present. And that's obviously a part of what that book is about thematically.
Okay, they're going to get mad at me. This is the second time I've gone too long, but because Amor is going to go and sign books across the way.
Some tent over
in that tent. Oh, that tent right there. So he will. Let's take one more question. I saw your hand first.
Shout.
They might be turning us off because they want us to end.
I can yell. So have you given thought to, or is there a plan for writing your own short stories, like of your life? I find whether it's the Harrison story or whatever else, it's A, lovely, B, could be curtailed into, leadership, self-awareness, whatever. So is that something that's on the horizon?
I do a little bit more of that in my short stories than I do in my long work. But even then, they're not really strictly autobiographical. For whatever reason, I just haven't been a writer who's interested in recreating for you the suburbs of Boston in the 70s. I don't know why. So I kind of liked it. This isn't my next novel, but one of the next 3 or 4, because I do all this long-term planning, is about 1977. Which is a big. When I was, I guess, 13. It's a very vivid sort of time of life. But that, for what is set in Los Angeles, I don't know why. Why would it be set on the East Coast? I don't know because I like to displace myself. I find that I'm a sharper observer when I'm displaced. But this came up earlier today, and so I'll share this. If you are a customer of Audible, one of my short stories that will be in the collection is called The DiDomenico Fragment. And Don Katz, who's here, and the team at Audible approached me and said, listen, we understand that story is too long to be published in a journal, but we'd love to turn it into an audio story. So several years ago, they did that. They got John Lithgow to read the story, and it's available for most people for free, I think, on Audible. But that story is about a family, a WASPy family, where a painting gets each generation, over 3 generations, a valuable Renaissance painting, because like the great-great-grandfather can't decide which of the 4 sons should get it, and he wants to be fair, so he cuts it into 4 paintings and has them all framed, and they each get one of the paintings. But then they keep doing it generation by generation. And so by now we're like in the present in New York City, and the hero, who's like 65 years old, has a painting. This is this big, And anyway, so the story that I'll quickly tell is that when I was a kid, my grandfather was a very practical, waspy guy in Boston, and he lived in a house where there was a full-length portrait of his great-grandmother facing a full-length portrait of his great-grandfather. and that were done by a prominent portrait artist of Boston in the 19th century. And when he moved with my grandmother at a later age to a smaller house with lower ceilings, he had the paintings cut in half so he could hang them in his dining room, because they wouldn't have fit otherwise, which I just always thought was like the greatest expression of like practical waspiness. Anyway, so that happens, like stuff like that. That then it gets translated into this other weird story of a different nature. But to actually write about the suburbs in the 70s, that's unlikely.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jenna.
Very much.
Thank you, Jenna.
Amor. That was